of hours. I spent hundreds of hours with him. Rabbi Seinfeld died a little less than a year ago. But the book that I want to center on today is a book that you may be familiar with, and that's this book, The 13-Petaled Rose. 13-Petaled Rose is Rabbi Seinfeld's introduction to Kabbalah. Actually, Rabbi Seinfeld had said many times that The 13-Petaled Rose is not a book about Kabbalah. It's a book of Kabbalah. I think that if you were to encounter it, you would agree. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to go through a bunch of ideas from this book that I think are among the biggest ideas that I've ever heard of. Certainly important ideas also that, again, are from the 13-Petaled Rose. Before I get into the 13-Petaled Rose, though, I want to mention one more thing about Kabbalah in general. One of the things that I had to do when I was driving Rabbi Steinsaltz around in New York was I had to take him to the annual meeting of the New York Board of Rabbis. Now, the New York Board of Rabbis is an amazing organization because you have Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Orthodox, all flavor rabbis in the room together, and everybody gets out alive. So it's really quite something to see such a phenomenon, the New York Board of Rabbis. But that particular meeting was the annual meeting, and Rabbi Steinsaltz was invited to give the keynote lecture, the keynote talk in front of all of these rabbis. The place was mobbed. There was not a seat to be had. People were out the door just wanting to listen to Rabbi Steinsaltz's keynote. So Rabbi Steinsaltz gets up to the podium, and he begins by saying, Kabbalah is the official theology of the Jewish people. He said, let me repeat that. Kabbalah is the official theology of the Jewish people. He said to the rabbis, if you're not studying it, if you're not teaching it, then one could fairly say that you're not doing your job. Kabbalah is the official theology of the Jewish people. And then he proceeded for the next hour or so to defend his position and to show that actually Kabbalah is the official theology of the Jewish people. This book, The 13-Petaled Rose, doesn't talk about customs and doesn't talk about history and doesn't talk about folkways and doesn't talk about holidays. But what the book does is it tries to communicate the abstract ideas that hold up the whole edifice of Kabbalah. The 13-Petaled Rose is filled with abstract ideas that, again, are important for the whole structure of our tradition, of Jewish tradition. So the first thing I want to say about the book, a lesson from the book, is that we already know all of it. We already know all of it. There's a story in the Talmud, you may be familiar with the story, that illustrates this. It's about Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva was a Kabbalist, if there ever was one. And so he's the great Kabbalist in the Talmud. And the story goes from the Talmud that he, one evening came and he was looking for a place to stay that night. So he gets to a town, he knocks on the door, and somebody comes out and says, what do you want? And Rabbi Akiva said, I wonder if there's a place where I can sleep here for the night. And the person said no, and he sent Rabbi Akiva away. Rabbi Akiva then went to the next house and knocked on the door and asked if he could have any lodging. And the person said, no, you can't. I don't have any space for you here. So he's going down the road trying to find somebody or someplace that will they'll give him a place to stay. But nobody does. Every time that somebody tells him that they have no place for him, he says, Gamzu Latova, Gamzu Latova, which is an Aramaic expression, which means this too is for the best. So every rejection that he got, he said, this too is for the best. After the whole evening goes by and he has no place to stay, the Talmud says that he goes out into the woods and he makes camp for himself there. And the Talmud then says that in the middle of the night, a rooster came and no, before the rooster came, it was I have to tell you that the Talmud says that he had with him, Rabbi Akiva had with him three things. He had with him a candle, a rooster, and a donkey. And the Talmud then says, suddenly a wind blows the candle out. And Rabbi Akiva said, Gam Zulatova, this is for the best. Talmud then says an animal came and killed his rooster. And Rabbi Akiva said, this too is for Gam Zulatova, this too is for the best. Then a wild animal came and killed his donkey. And Rabbi Akiva watched this happen and said, Gam Zulatova, this is for the best. The story in the Talmud goes on to say that the next morning, Rabbi Akiva got up for the day and went back into the town that had refused him lodging, at which point the Talmud explains that he encountered a town where during the middle of the night, a band of hooligans came and destroyed property and injured people and killed people. And that was the end of the story. Now, the message of the story is clear. Gam Zulatova, this is for the best. Had he been given lodging in the town, he may have been a victim of these hooligans. Had the candle not been blown out by a wind, they might have detected him in the woods. If an animal didn't kill the rooster, he might have also been detected. And finally, if the animal didn't kill the donkey, then surely he would have been noticed in the woods and probably been victimized also. Our tradition teaches us that we need to try to integrate this idea into our lives, that everything is for the best. That means everything. That we might not see it, but everything is for the best. Gam Zulatova. This is one of the Kabbalists' creeds. That Gam Zulatova, everything is for the best. But as I said before, one of the ideas that Rabbi Seinfeld communicates in his book is that we already know all of this. That we're not when we're learning Kabbalah, we're not learning something new. We're learning something that we've already known but forgot. In fact, there's in the introduction to the 13 Petaled Rose, Rabbi Seinfeld says the following. Excuse me. Rabbi Seinfeld writes, this little book is a book for the soul. It begins quite deliberately, and perhaps to the dismay of some readers, with a view of another reality. It does not proceed from this world or from the familiar ways of man in our society. Instead, this book seeks to go from the genuine center of all being to the world and to human life. There's no attempt to speak of Judaism here, to prove its worth or to justify it, rather to let the message communicate itself. And if a person permits his soul to listen, the soul will soon learn that all it needs to do is remember, because in some dim and enigmatic way, it already knows all this. So for us, learning Kabbalah is reminding ourselves before we were born, what we were doing. We were basking in God's infinite light. And then when the baby is born, an angel slaps the baby on the mouth to kind of jolt it into this new world that the baby is in. And the Talmud says that the philtrum, which is a little notch underneath your nose, between your nose and your upper lip, that angel did two things when he slapped the little baby being born. Number one, he created the notch below the nose, the philtrum. And the second thing is that he caused the baby to forget everything that it knew from its previous incarnation. So that once again, we already know all of this. Another idea that is important in this book is that we don't believe that some people believe that you're just a body. You're born, you live, you die, and that's what the existence is all about. Now, there are other people who say, no, we're not just a body. We're a body that has a soul. And this is a point of view also. Now, in Jewish tradition, in Kabbalistic tradition, we don't believe either of those two notions. We don't believe that we're just a soul, or just a body, and we don't believe that we're a body that has a soul. Our belief is that we're a soul that has a body. The soul existed before this particular body. The soul picks up a body and uses it for 70, 80, 90 years, whatever it is. And then at a certain point, the soul drops the body and goes on with its work. We're not a body that has a soul. We're a soul that has a body. And that's a very important distinction that's being made. You just sit and think about that for a lifetime, and it makes a difference. Rabbi Seinfeld in his book also says a lot of paradoxes. One of them is that acknowledging the incomprehensibility of this topic is a giant step in the direction of understanding. To begin by realizing that you can't understand it is paradoxically the step which allows you to begin to understand it. For example, in the 13 Petal Rose, Rabbi Steinsaltz has a chapter called The Soul. At the beginning of the chapter, he says it's impossible to understand the soul. In the chapter, there's a chapter in the book called Holiness. And at the beginning of the chapter, Rabbi Steinsaltz says there's no possibility to grasp holiness. And on, mitzvot and repentance and all the other chapters. In almost every chapter in the book, Rabbi Steinsaltz says, it's impossible to grasp this stuff. It's just impossible to understand this stuff. But again, surprisingly, realizing that we cannot understand it becomes a giant step in the direction of understanding. Another idea from the book that I think is sometimes misunderstood is that God did not create the world. Despite the fact that it says in the first line of the Torah that God created the heaven and earth and so forth in the beginning, Kabbalists since time immemorial do not have a sense that God created the world. We don't have this notion that God created the world. Instead, our notion is that God creates the world, that God is constantly creating the world, that God is totally involved with every aspect of life and is sustaining the world by the divine plenty that it comes down from above, that God is constantly creating the world, as if, as somebody once wrote, as if God were to turn his head to another direction and the whole universe would disappear. That it's God's constant supplying of divine plenty that continues to create the world. And once again, there's a big difference between thinking that God created the world. You see, you may know this book by Rabbi Harold Kushner called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. I call the book When Bad Books Happen to Jewish People. It's because Rabbi Kushner in his book, and by the way, I've spoken to him about it face to face, so it's not as if I'm talking behind his back about his book, but Harold Kushner in that book describes the classic view of heresy. Rabbi Kushner said, "I can't believe that God is all-knowing and can do everything that's possible. I don't, because if God was all-knowing, he wouldn't let bad things happen to good people." And again, this is just a fallacy. We believe that God, in fact, there's a chapter in the book called God Can't Do Everything. Well, the fact is that by definition, our God can do anything and everything. So Rabbi Kushner concluded that God is all-knowing, but not all-powerful. That God knows everything that's going on, but he set things up that he can't intervene. And this again is just not part of our tradition. It's a rewrite in some way or other. One of the additional fallacies about this notion of God and the belief in God is that we often use an analogy or similar to an analogy that God is the CEO of the universe, that God is in charge of the whole universe and he's the CEO. Now, if I were to think about, let's say I would think about the local General Motors car dealership, and the assistant manager in that dealership has a secretary. Do I think that God cares as much about that secretary as he does about anything else? And the answer is yes, because God is not the CEO of the universe. The CEO of General Motors, he doesn't know who the assistant director's secretary is in a local General Motors dealership in my neighborhood. God is aware of everything and is infinite in every possible degree, so that everything is known by God and everything is controlled by God. And this is a basic notion of Kabbalah that is difficult to grasp, difficult to ingest, and difficult to integrate into your life. But the fact of the matter is that when we conceive of God as infinite to the infinite degree, we believe in a God that is involved with everything that goes on in the universe. There's the fiercest teaching related to what I was just talking about appears in the 13 Petaled Rose, where Rabbi Steinsaltz writes, Because the divine is apprehended as an infinite, not a finite force, everything in the cosmos, whether small or large, is only a small part of the pattern. So that there's no difference in weight or gravity between any one part and another. The movement of a man's finger is as important or unimportant as the most terrible catastrophe, for as against the infinite, both are of the same dimension. Now, it's a pretty fierce teaching and a pretty difficult teaching, but from the point of view of the infinite, whether large or small, to the infinite is the same size. God cares about every detail of our world, not just big things, what we think are big things, but big things and small things in all of our lives. Rabbi Steinsaltz was a mathematician early in his life. He has a degree from Hebrew University in mathematics and in chemistry as well. And he uses a interesting mathematical analogy to talk about what is faith. And he mentions that there's a theorem in geometry. It's not in plane geometry, but it's in a geometry that moves and has cones, like little V-shaped cones. In that field of geometry, there's a theorem. It's called Desargues' theorem. You can look up Desargues' theorem on the internet and you'll find lots of explanations of this theorem. It's relatively easy to understand when you read it through thoroughly. The only problem with Desargues' theorem is that you can't prove it. It's one of those theorems that you can't prove until you do something. And that is to introduce into the picture the infinite, a point in the infinite. Once you conceive of a point in the infinite, then the theorem is able to be proven very easily. And that's what faith is. Faith is that we invite the infinite into our lives and things suddenly change. Theorems can suddenly be proved. Without God, life becomes one big question mark. But when we invite God into our life, when we invite the infinite into the equation, that equation can be solved and can be proven. That's Desargues' theorem. Now, another one of the sayings of the Kabbalists relates back to the story of Rabbi Akiva that I mentioned, and that is that every descent is for the sake of ascension. Every descent is for the sake of ascension. That when you go down, that down is not down. That down is the force that needs to be created for you to get to the next up. What Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, what did he say was the most important teaching? He said the most important teaching, most important, not teaching, but the most important phenomenon is depression. Now, I'm not talking about clinical depression. I'm talking about somebody who's sad and depressed because they've fallen for some reason or other. Rabbi Nachman says every descent is for the sake of ascension. That we don't have a notion in Jewish tradition of down, because every down is for the sake of the next up. So when you fall, one of the things you do is you pick yourself up, and then you know something that you didn't know before you fell, and that is that you're able to pick yourself up. That every descent is for the sake of ascension. If you were to go to an amusement park and see a roller coaster, that principle is certainly in play there. How does the cart of the roller coaster get up to that high point? Well, first it has to come very fast down. And then when it gets very fast down, then it's able to go up and to achieve the height of the next part of the roller coaster. So that it's our obligation, say the Kabbalistic tradition, that we should never despair because you're going down. That every descent is for the sake of ascension. There's even a nigun that's sung in a number of the Hasidic groups where the words from Hebrew are a descent for the sake of ascension. That life itself is a descent for the sake of ascension. A whole chapter in 13 Petaled Rose is devoted to one simple idea. A lot of the book is complicated, and a lot of the book uses technical jargon and vocabulary, but there's one chapter in the book that's very simple. One simple idea, but a huge, huge, huge idea. And that is the fact that in Jewish tradition, we don't have a list of emotions that with a hierarchy. Some of our Christian neighbors believe that there is a hierarchy, that love is on the top. And then they go down, down, down the list of human emotions. We don't have such a notion. Our notion is instead of what Rabbi Steinsaltz calls the way of choice. I call it timing and dosage. That there's nothing, love is not better than hate. Sometimes love is not the appropriate thing. Sometimes you have a condition where love is just what's called for. Hate is not bad. God created everything, including hate. Hate is not always bad. Sometimes hate is exactly what the situation calls for. I don't go into the hospital and look at my grandmother and say, Grandma, you look worse than you did yesterday. That's what a lie is for. It's a white lie that has compassion for the individual. So everything in life has a negative aspect and has a positive aspect. And it all has to do not with what is intrinsic to the word or to the emotion, but rather how it's used. Everything has to do with timing and dosage. How much of that emotion should you have, and when should you have it? That's the way of the Kabbalist. At every moment, trying to be conscious of what does this next moment call for. I want to say that there's a chapter in the book called Repentance. And in the chapter on repentance, Rabbi Steinsaltz offers an interesting statement where he says that despair is an essential part of tshuva, of repentance. So despair is essential when you're doing tshuva, when you're trying to turn your life to another direction. That despair is essential to that process. So in other words, next time you feel some despair, don't despair, because despair is just an element that one needs to have to generate enough energy and enough motivation to get you over that despair and to move towards true repentance, a true turning. So despair is an essential part of tshuva. Rabbi Steinsaltz says in the 13 Petal Rose that every time you ask yourself the question, who am I? What am I doing? Who am I? I would say that in Kabbalah, we're interested in who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going? What's this thing all about? Rabbi Steinsaltz suggests in the book that when you hear a voice in your head saying, where are you? What am I doing? Why am I in this situation? Where am I? Where am I going? That we experience that as being our inner voice asking ourselves a question. But Rabbi Steinsaltz suggests, no, when you hear the question, who am I? That's the voice of God asking you the same question God asked Adam, where are you? As the rabbi says, that question continues to echo in the world. And every time that you hear yourself saying, who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going? What am I supposed to be doing in this life? That this is God's voice, actually God's voice asking you that question. In relation to that, Rabbi Steinsaltz deals a lot with the question of identity. Who am I again? Who am I? And the rabbi suggests that we too often define ourselves in the wrong way. We define ourselves as this one's brother, or this one's son, or this one's father, or this one's employer, or this one's employee, or this one's wife, or this one's neighbor. But Rabbi Steinsaltz points out that to define yourself in relation to any of those that I just listed is defining yourself in connection with a secondary relationship. Your only primary relationship is our connection to God. God is our primary relationship. All the others are secondary relationships. The only way that you're going to be able to define yourself, to define who I am and where I come from and where am I going, is to have a relationship with God. In fact, there's an interesting midrash. It's in a collection of midrashim called the Midrash of Rabbi Eliyahu, Rabbi Elijah. Now, it's not about Elijah the prophet. It's about a certain rabbi whose name happened to be Eliyahu. And there's a collection of midrashic stories and teachings in that book. It's translated into English, by the way, by Yale University Press. In the book, the midrash says there are 4 reasons why people get married. Three of them are not good, and one is good. Sometimes people get married, number one, for social status. Sometimes people marry for money. Sometimes people marry for sex. Now, all of those are very important in life, but they have nothing to do with defining yourself. The only way you can define yourself is in relationship to God. So that when you get married, the person who you marry, and you, both of you together, need to understand that you are not my primary relationship. Now, maybe I'm. It's the wrong time to talk about this because my wife is on the call also. But my wife and I, my wife is not my primary relationship. My primary relationship is my relationship to God. And who do you marry? You marry the person who can help you with your primary relationship. That's what it's all about. That's the one reason that people should get married, to help each other with their primary relationship, with their relationship to God. It's only in relation to God that I can find myself. In 30 Petal Rose, Rabbi Steinsaltz has one brief sentence which is enormous that I just want to recite by memory. Rabbi Steinsaltz says, if you think you've arrived, you're lost. If you think you've arrived, you're lost. That this going towards God, going after God year after year is an endless pursuit. We're not supposed to be preoccupied with getting there. We're preoccupied with coming closer, but because God is infinite, there's no way in which you can reach the infinite. So the rabbi says, if there's no way you can reach the infinite, if you think you've arrived, you're lost. Then how do you know if you've made any progress? How do you know if you've made any progress if God is always as distant as ever? And the rabbi suggests that what you do every once in a while is you pause and you look back and you see how far you've come. And then after you see how far you've come, you turn around once again and see how far you need to get. And that is an infinite path. That if you think you've arrived, you're lost. Now, one of the interesting interpretations of the eating of the sin, the sin of eating the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Rabbi Steinsaltz in the 30 Petal Rose discusses it and clarifies it. What are we doing being forbidden to eat the tree of knowledge? I thought that we Jews are knowledge people. We are in favor of education and increasing our knowledge. And yet we find in the Torah, in Genesis, that God, that you're supposed to avoid the tree of knowledge. So what is the sin of the tree of knowledge? The sin of the tree of knowledge is knowing more than you need to know, where your head gets stuffed with all kinds of unrelated facts. I used to apologize to my children. They're now grown, but when they were in grade school, I used to apologize to them for sending them to school, because in school most of the time you just learn heaps and heaps, as the rabbi says, heaps and heaps of unrelated facts, which only serve to obscure reality, not to clarify reality. That the sin of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is learning more than you're ready to know yet. And then that obfuscates reality rather than clarifies reality. That notion of knowing. That it is not an advantage to know and know and know and know all kinds of trivia and all kinds of facts, because these facts don't relate, or often don't relate to my soul, to who I really am. That teachings that relate to my soul, that helps me to know who I am and know where I've come from and know where I'm going. But heaps and heaps of unrelated facts don't clarify the path of the Kabbalists. They just obscure it. They just obfuscate reality, and that's important. And Rabbi Seinfeld offers an interesting twist that I find fascinating. You know, we have the 4 levels of Torah study. There's the pshat. Pshat is, what does the text say? Just what is the sentence saying? Then you have remez, which is a hint. Not what does the text say, but what does the text imply? Then you have the 3rd level of Torah explication, which is drash. It's not what does it say, and it's not what does it hint at, but it's rather what's the lesson to be learned? What's the homiletic to encounter there? And then the 4th of the 4 levels of Torah understanding is sod, which means the secret. It isn't the literal understanding. It's not the message. It's not the hint. It's the secret of the tradition. Now, Rabbi Steinsaltz points out that often people think that the Torah is pshat, and the Zohar, that great book of Kabbalah, is the sod. That the Torah is, what does it say? What is it? Just from reading it to see what it says. Whereas when you look at the Zohar, you often think, oh, this is the secret. This is the sod. Rabbi Seinfeld points out that no, it's exactly the opposite way. That in the Torah, it's all secret. Everything is there, but it's all hidden in there. You don't see it out. You don't see teachings about reincarnation in the Torah. It's all hidden there. Whereas in the Zohar, it's all pshat. It's all you just read it to see what it says. So really, the Zohar is pshat, and the Chumash is the sod. Along the same lines, Rabbi Seinfeld points out that the Talmud and the Zohar are both saying the same thing. It isn't that the Talmud is one aspect of knowledge and that the Zohar is another. It's rather they're saying the same thing in different languages. So that the story that I related before about Rabbi Akiva knocking on the door and ultimately saying Gamzu Latova, this is for the best, you don't have you have that in the Talmud. But the notion of Gamzu Latova is explored in detail in the Zohar. They're both saying the same thing, but they're using different languages to say it. Speaking of different languages, I want to point out something about the 13 Petal Rose, the latest edition. When reading this book, when studying this book, you find that it's a very slim book. There's 180 pages. And the typeface is pretty big, and the leading between the lines is pretty big also. So it's not only 180 little pages, but also very little on every page. In the first edition of the 13 Petal Rose, there were 2 chapters on the 10 Sfirot. When the new edition came out, Rabbi Seinfeld added a 3rd chapter, and the 3rd chapter is a chapter about the 10 Sfirot. In other words, in a very slim book about Jewish tradition and Jewish ideas and Jewish theology, the rabbi is pointing out that the mastering of the 10 Sfirot is essential to the study. When you look at a story in the Torah, for example, of Abraham bringing Isaac to the slaughter, if you see Abraham as chesed and you see Isaac as gevura, suddenly the story takes on additional meaning. Each of these patriarchs represent one of the Sfirot. So to be able to master the Sfirot, to understand or begin to understand what these 10 Sfirot are, is a way of understanding the Torah, and certainly a way of studying Zohar, which is the basic language. This 10 Sfirot is the basic language of the Zohar. I also want to say that, I said it before, but it's worth saying again, I think, that in Jewish tradition, our sages teach us that God creates everything, even evil. There's nothing in the world that exists that God hasn't created. So just as a simple principle, God creates everything. Now, there was one time when I had to bring Rabbi Steinsaltz to a modern Orthodox synagogue after Shabbos was over, and he was scheduled to give a lecture when that evening. So he walks into the room with a bottle of schnapps under his arm, and he has cups in his hand, and he's giving out cups and pouring with the whiskey for each of the people to enjoy. And he proceeds to give a lecture on the benefits of getting drunk. Now, when he says drunk, he doesn't mean unruly drunk. He doesn't mean drink to an excess, but he means that when you drink that little bit of whiskey, you get a little bit unstable. And there's a great advantage to being a little bit unstable. It's like an airplane. When is the airplane most unstable? It's most unstable when it's taking off and when it's landing. While it's flying, it's as stable as it's going to get. It's only when you take off that you have to go through an unstable period that allows you to then fly. So that Rabbi Seinfeld says a way to learn is to not be so sure of yourself and to be a little bit unstable. It's like a climbing up a ladder. When you climb up a ladder, your feet are on each of the rungs of the ladder, and each time your foot is on the rungs, you're stable. It's when you go from one rung to the other that there's a moment there when you're the most unstable. But in order for you to make progress and to climb that ladder, you have to be unstable. You have to admit and welcome the instability, that it's the instability that opens you up to the new teachings. I see we have about 15 minutes to go, so I do want to spend some time with questions. But I want to tell two things first. One is, this is the most profound story I've ever heard. I'm about to tell you the most profound story I've ever heard. So I think to myself, it better be good, because I'm introducing it as the most profound story I've ever heard. And the story is a story about a chassid who's studying Talmud. And the Talmud says that everything is for the best. The Talmud says that it's all for the best. So he goes over to the Rebbe, the Maggid of Mezrich, and he says, Rabbi, I've been studying Talmud, and I've been studying the Talmud section called Brachos, which is about blessings. And I understand why the rabbis give us all these blessings for all the enjoyments in life, all the different kind of foods and the rainbow and a beautiful person. And there's all kinds of blessings that we say that are written there in the section of the Talmud called Brachos. But the student then says to the Rebbe, I also see that in the Talmud there's a blessing on suffering. And he said, I don't understand. How could you be, I can understand blessing God for giving you a good livelihood or good health or delicious food, but why is there a blessing on suffering? And the Maggid of Mezrich, the Rebbe, says to the student, you know Reb Zusha? Go ask Reb Zusha, he'll be able to explain it to you. The chassid goes over to Reb Zusha. Zusha is living in an old dilapidated shack. He's an old man, he's impoverished, and he's very sickly. Chassid knocks on the door, and out comes old Reb Zusha and says to the chassid, can I help you? Can I help you with something? And the chassid said, yes, I've been studying the Talmud, the section called blessings, brachot. And I understand why the rabbis give us all these blessings on all the pleasantries of life. But then the rabbis say that there's a blessing on suffering. And I don't understand. So I went to the Rebbe and I asked him, could he please explain this? And the Rebbe said, I should go to you, that you'd be able to explain it to me. And Reb Zusha said, I don't understand why the Rebbe asked you to see me about this question. You see, he said, I never experienced any suffering. And that was the end of the story. In other words, the Reb Zusha was able to see that every descent is for the sake of ascension. That when you're suffering, that suffering has a reason for it. And you can take that suffering and you can thank God even for the suffering if you can make the suffering into something constructive, which is what we're supposed to be able to learn how to do. He never said that blessing. So one more story, and I'll finish, and that is, about 40 years ago, when 13 Petal Rose just first came out, I was reading it every day and every night. And I was living in Brooklyn, and I had my office was in Manhattan. So and the children were arriving, and the apartment that we were living in was too crowded for all of us. So I said, well, we have to move. We have to find someplace else, as long as we stay on the F train. The F train of the subway system. Now, one reason the F train I wanted is because, at least at that time, the F train was the best line in the city. The cars were clean. They were more modern. There was air conditioning in every car, and I wanted to stay on the F train to get to my office. The second reason why I wanted to stay on the F train is because the F train goes from all of the religious neighborhoods in Brooklyn to Midtown Manhattan, which is where my office was. And on every morning and every evening, on every car on the F train, you could have a minyan. You had men who were studying Talmud, and you had women who were reciting the Psalms, and it was like Jewish Disney World to me. And I wanted to be around those people, so I wanted to stay on the F train. Well, one day, the F train was going back into Brooklyn, taking me home, and I was sitting on a seat. I got a seat, and I was sitting next to this old chassid. I would say he was about 80 years old. Now, my first Talmud teacher taught me that when you are with a fellow Jew, you shouldn't go 2 cubits without talking Torah. Now, a cubit is from the tip of your elbow to the tip of your finger. It's the ancient yardstick. It's called a cubit. And the Talmud says you shouldn't travel 2 cubits with a fellow Jew without talking Torah. And there I am on the subway, sitting next to this old chassid, and we're certainly in the subway car going through more than just 2 cubits. But I wasn't talking to him. He wasn't talking to me. Nobody was talking to anybody in those days on the subway. The etiquette on the subway is you leave me alone, I'll leave you alone. But I kept on thinking, the Talmud teaches us that we should talk Torah with our fellow Jews. You shouldn't go 2 cubits without talking Torah to a fellow Jew. So I was reading the 13 Petal Rose, and the chassid was reading the New York Post. And I was feeling very good about myself, because here I was studying a book of Kabbalah, and this chassid was reading this questionable newspaper called the New York Post. But I'm trying to get up the courage to talk to him, to say something to him. And finally, I got up the courage, and I said, "Excuse me." And the chassid put down his New York Post, and he looked at me and he said, "Yes." I said, "Did you ever see this book?" And he took the book from my hand, and he looked through it, and he said, "No, I never saw this book, but I don't usually read books unless they have 2 haskamas." Now, a haskama is like a seal of approval. It's an introduction or a foreword by somebody and says kosher book. Even today, in the religious neighborhoods, you'll find, in religious publishers, you'll find books that have these haskamas in the front, the seal of approval. So the chassid, I don't usually read books unless they have 2 haskamas. At which point I thought to myself, well, where is the haskama on the New York Post, please? But I didn't tell him that because I wanted to make friends with him. So he surprised me, and he said, "Well, it doesn't matter that much. What's the book about?" And I took the book back from him, and I showed him the table of contents, and I showed him there's a chapter called the soul, there's a chapter called holiness, there's a chapter called Torah, a chapter called repentance, a chapter called mitzvot. It's a basic introduction to Jewish theology. And he said, "No, I never saw the book." But we got to talking. And when we were talking, I was telling him about my life. He was asking me, and I was telling him that I grew up in an assimilated home. I grew up in a home that did not offer me a Jewish education. It wasn't until I left my parents' home that I started to do a little exploring of Jewish tradition, and that's taken me a long way. So I was telling this chassid sitting next to me that I have lots of troubles with Judaism. I'm having a lot of trouble integrating new ideas into my being. I'm having a lot of trouble grasping and understanding new notions that I never came across before. And then I said to him, "In fact, can I ask you a question?" And he said, "Sure." And I turned to a page in the 13 Petal Rose, and this is what the page says. "It has been said that each of the letters of the Torah has some corresponding soul. That is to say, every soul is a letter in the entire Torah and has its own part to play. The soul that has fulfilled its task, the soul that has done what it has to do in terms of creating or repairing its own part of the world and realizing its own essence, that soul can wait after death for the perfection of the world as a whole. It goes on, but not all the souls are so privileged. Many souls stray for one reason or another. Sometimes a person does not do all the proper things, and sometimes he misuses forces and spoils his portion and the portion of others. In such cases, the soul does not complete its task and may even be damaged by contact with the world. It has not managed to complete that portion of reality which only this particular soul can complete, and therefore, after the death of the body, the soul returns and is reincarnated in the body of another person, and again must try and complete what it failed to correct or what it injured in the past. I said to the chassid sitting next to me on the subway that afternoon, "Do we believe this?" He said, "Of course." I said, "Jews believe in reincarnation? I never heard of it before." He said to me, "Well, where did you get your Jewish education?" And I said, "Well, I didn't get much of a Jewish education." And he said, "Well, that's why you never heard of it. But reincarnation is truly a principle that in Jewish theology." So we were talking a little bit more on the train as the train was going and approaching Brooklyn. And the chassid then looked at me and said, "You know, you're luckier than I am." And I said to him, "How could you say that I'm luckier than you are? I just got finished telling you that I never had a Jewish education as a young person, that I'm having lots and lots of difficulty integrating some of these ideas into my life. How can you say that I'm luckier than you are?" And the chassid said, "Well, every Jew is connected to God like a rope, with a rope. And sometimes the rope breaks, as in my case, with the rope broke in my family. And what you have to do sometimes is you have to find the two ends of the rope and tie it back together. And when you tie it back together, that broken rope, not only does it become shorter, but it also becomes stronger." He said, "Your return to Judaism, you're luckier than I am, because you're in the process of finding those two ends of the rope." And I feel that from that day until today, that's become the theme of my life. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to find the two ends of the rope that broke and see if I can tie them back together. So the Talmud was right. You shouldn't go 2 cubits with a fellow Jew without talking Torah. And I certainly got, again, my money's worth speaking to this gentleman on the F train that afternoon. So I see we have 4 or 5 minutes left, and I'm wondering whether or not anybody has any comments or questions or objections that they want to raise.
Well, let me just first say we could stay beyond 1 o'clock if that's okay, so long as there are questions. So there's no fixed time if we go beyond 1. So people should, unless you have something to go to or something.
I have something in a half hour, but I
okay.
got plenty of time.
Okay, great. So I'll turn it over. Anyone else have questions? Please unmute yourself. And
I just want to say thank you. It was amazing, absolutely amazing. Well, I just want to know why I had to reach 85 before I got it.
Well, you know, Rabbi Akiva, they say, didn't know Aleph from Bet until he was 40 years old. His whole life up to 40 was as an ignorant shepherd. So, but at 40, he learned Aleph Beis, and of course, he became the greatest Talmud scholar, Talmud character that in the entire Talmud. He's the superstar of the Talmud. So, I'm sure you know that, but yeah, I relate to that. Also, where was I all this time? Yes.
I have a question. First, thank you very much. That was an amazing lecture, and I feel like my soul has been nourished. So thank you. I wonder if you can tell us about the title of the book. I know that the 13-petaled rose means something.
Yeah, it's a quote from the Zohar. It's actually a quote from the opening lines of the Zohar. So the image of it says, "As a rose among the thorns, so is my love among the maidens." And the book goes on to say that the 13-petaled rose is the symbol of Jews in that garden where the rose with 13 petals. And that number 13, of course, relates to other things in our tradition, like the 13 attributes that we say on Rosh Hashanah and so forth. So that he's simply giving a nod to the Zohar here to say to the reader, this is a book of Kabbalah, and that's how the title came to be that title.
Thank you. Does the rose symbolize like Israel in any way, or Jacob?
Yes, he goes on to say, what is the rose? It is Knesset Israel, the community of Israel. For there is a rose above and a rose below. Just as the rose which is among the thorns has red and white, so does Knesset Israel have justice and mercy. Just as a rose has 13 petals, so does Knesset Israel have 13 measures of compassion, encompassing it on all sides. 5 strong petals surround the rose, and these 5 are called salvations. There are 5 gates, concerning which it is written, I will lift the cup of salvation. It might be an appropriate time to say that when you make Kiddush on Friday night, and you take the glass and you hold the glass to make Kiddush, this is not the way to hold the glass. According to Kabbalah, the way you hold the glass is like this. Because your hands become those 5 petals that he just mentioned, and the cup of wine becomes the rose. So every detail of the Kiddush ritual on Friday night is deliberate and comes from Kabbalistic tradition. There's a chapter in the book 13 Petal Rose called An Additional Note on the Kiddush Ritual, where the rabbi points out that every detail from the number of words in the Kiddush, which is 70 words. Now, don't go to your prayer book and count 70, because you're not going to find it. It was there was an original Kiddush that appears in the Talmud, and it has 70 letters, which is symbolic within our tradition. So next time on Friday night, if you want to make Kiddush like the Kabbalists have, you hold the book in your hands, and the glass and the wine becomes the rose, and you become the petals surrounding the rose.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Anyone else have a question or?
Well, are the 5 fingers too? Are the 5 spiritual worlds from Adam Kadmon up down to what's the Asiya? There's also that we're supporting the Kli, on the five spiritual realms.
That's right. It's rich with symbolism, and that certainly is one of the comments that's made. Right.
Any other questions? I have a question. A lot of my most recent over the last few years, I've been heavily influenced by the teachings of Rabbi Yehuda Ashlag, who's known as Baho Shalom. I know in your book, Kabbalah for Dummies, he really, other than one reference, I think, to his son, you didn't really touch upon him. But are you familiar with him? And what is your feelings about his teachings?
Well, I am familiar with him. Actually, you were mentioning before we started formally about Madonna. And the Kabbalah Center is very much connected to Rabbi Ashlag's teachings through his so-called son-in-law. So it's another school of Kabbalah. There's so many different schools, different teachers. You have to find a teacher that resonates with you. And for many people, what Rabbi Ashlag did was he revealed a lot of the secrets. Rather than keep the text obscure, he felt strongly, as Rabbi Seinsaltz does, that we have to clarify. We can't afford not to. There are too many people who are leading the tradition. I used to go into New Age bookstores a lot. I'm sure you've seen some of these New Age bookstores. And when you go in, you see there are books on Buddhism, on different kinds of Buddhism, and on Hinduism, on Native American, on all kinds of things. And there's often no books about Judaism. If there is a book about Judaism, sometimes they have some of the Kabbalah Center's books. Sometimes they have a copy of one of the volumes of Rabbi Seinsaltz's Talmud there. So when you go to the books in the other sections, you see all these beautiful, lofty ideas about so many different things, about love and about relationships and brotherhood and this and that. And then you go to the first volume of the Talmud, and you open up to the first page of the Talmud, which is page 2. There's never a page 1 in the Talmud. It's always page 2. But at the beginning of the, and the reason, by the way, is because there's no beginning. You have to just jump in someplace. The Talmud is called the sea, S-E-A, the sea of Talmud. There's no beginning to the sea. You just have to jump in somewhere. So it always begins page. In the history of the printing of the Talmud, there's never been a volume of the Talmud where the first page is page 1. It always starts page 2. From the most ancient to the most modern editions of the Talmud, it always starts page 2. But when you pick up that volume, the first volume, Bava Metzia, and you go to the first page, page 2, how does the Talmud begin? It begins by saying, if Ruvain is holding a shmata, and Shimon is holding a shmata, and Ruvain thinks it's his shmata, and Shimon thinks it's his shmata, whose shmata is it? So I have great empathy, sympathy for people who don't know as much to think that they're going into a New Age bookstore. They're trying to explore their lives in a spiritual way. They have all these beautiful books by all the traditions. And then you go to the page 1, as it were, page 2 of the Talmud, and it's talking about shmatas and who owns the shmata. Where I'm looking for God, and they're talking about who owns this person or that person. So what we need is something like in Rav Ashlag's generation, we need somebody to take some of those teachings and make them relevant, make them connected to modern life. And among other things, Rabbi Ashlag was known for that. By the way, it might be interesting to mention something else, excuse me, and that is that the Vilna Gaon, if you have any sense of who the Vilna Gaon is, you picture the Vilna Gaon as this very strict halachic Litvak, and certainly not a Chassid. He was against the Hasidic movement, but if you were to search the literature, you find that Sefer Yetzirah, which is one of the basic books of Kabbalah, the great commentary on Sefer Yetzirah was written by the Vilna Gaon. Now, he believed that it should be secret, that the masses aren't ready for this. Whereas Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, had the opposite position. He felt that we should spread this knowledge and spread this information and spread these teachings. Now, obviously, in the battle between the Vilna Gaon and the Baal Shem Tov won, because now we can learn these things not just if we're an elite group, but anybody can open up many of these books, including Rabbi Ashlag's books, and certainly Rabbi Steindal's books, and begin to understand how it relates to me, not just some abstract notions that seem disconnected from reality. So the Vilna Gaon, I like to remind us that the Vilna Gaon was a Kabbalist. You never think that. You think that he's this strict halachist. But another one, by the way, is Joseph Caro. Joseph Caro was the author of the Shulchan Aruch, which is the code of Jewish law, the definitive, authoritative code of Jewish law. That was Joseph Caro. What people don't often know about Joseph Caro is that he believed in reincarnation. He wrote about reincarnation. There's even a manuscript at the Jewish Theological Seminary that was written by Joseph Caro, but Joseph Caro claims that he never wrote it, that it was automatic writing. That and in fact, the author of the song L'cho Dodi that we sing on Friday nights, he writes in one of his writings that he even saw Joseph Caro writing this automatic writing, which sounds very New Age, but actually this was one of the practices that the great sages throughout the centuries believed in and taught and learned and practiced. We had a big cataclysm that happened in our history with a character named Shabbatai Tzvi. So some of the greatest rabbis in the world, as well as the masses of Jews, believed Shabbatai Tzvi when he claimed to be the Messiah. Well, it ended up he wasn't the Messiah, but so it was a terrible thing in Jewish communities that suddenly this person that we thought was the Messiah, even again the greatest rabbis recognized him as the Messiah, that he was really one of the false messiahs. And often it's Kabbalah that's blamed for it. This notion got around that it's because Shabbatai Tzvi taught Kabbalah, there must be something wrong with Kabbalah, so let's avoid it. And we are still reverberating from that cataclysm. Unfortunately, in this generation, in our generation, let my people know has become the motto, that we have to learn this stuff. We have to learn this maybe before we learn all the customs and all the customs of holidays and so forth. They're meaningless if they have you have no idea where they come from, what they represent. But if you study a little bit of Kabbalah and you see that every detail of the Kiddush is Kabbalistic, and you see that the 7 shepherds who you invite into the sukkah every year, and on and on and on, this is all Kabbalistic ideas, Kabbalistic notions.
I want to do it.
So that's my feeling about it.
I think what's interesting, the way like you said that the Baal Shem Tov won on that struggle, whether it should be secret or not, it really goes back to the tree of knowledge. I mean, as soon as you put something forbidden on it, labeled as forbidden, the secret's going to get out. So, I mean, God knew that, in my opinion, God knew that Adam and Eve were going to eat from the tree. And that's our tradition kind of says, maybe they should have waited. They were supposed to wait till the end of Shabbat, according to some part of tradition. But in other words, the secret was going to get out. So it's the same with Kabbalah. If you try to keep it a tight knit around it, or a tight box around it, eventually it's going to break out. Somebody's going to want to poke their head in there and see what's in there. Pandora's box,
Well,
Yeah.
Yes,
Henry,
sir.
do you have a question?
Yes, a comment. We're talking about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. If God is all-knowing, he would have known. He could have said to Adam, eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and you'll learn something. But he wanted Adam and Eve to learn. The rabbi here was talking about a descent before an ascent. Okay. Adam and Eve would never grow, never fulfill their destiny staying in the Garden of Eden by themselves. They would have never gotten any better. Okay. They needed a descent to precede an ascent. Okay. And the purpose of the whole episode was to cause a descent that would lead to an ascent eventually. My readings say that God loves potentiality. God wants to see growth. He doesn't want us to stay the same. And actually, I'd like to comment on that also. The rabbi has a book which I read about the purpose of God creating evil. And it was the same kind of thesis that without evil, we would never get better. We would never reach higher levels of good. And he also said, this was a very interesting book. I can't remember the title of it. I read it a long time ago. He said, he was talking about in the Bible, in the beginning chapters of the Bible, God is nearby. God talks to Abraham, to Moses, various others, and God's presence is nearby. But in our current age, it's not so noticeable. And the author of this book says that the work of Tzimtzum is continuing. In other words, the void in which God created the earth is expanding, and God is getting farther away from us to leave room for us to grow by ourselves. And this is to me is the meaning of Kabbalah, to grow, to fill that void, to get closer from God who is hiding from us, you may say. Right. Rabbi, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I think it was beautifully put. In many books it talks about the metaphor of God hiding, and it's our job to find God. Adam and Eve were expressing their free will, which is the divine spark within us. So I'm grateful for your comment, and I'm with you on that, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to mention one more thing before we're going to close up, unless anybody has a burning question that needs to be asked. When I was in my 20s, I began to explore Judaism a little bit. And for some reason or other, I was successful at making an appointment with Elie Wiesel for a semester of, he was teaching at City College. I wrote him a letter again, and he invited me to meet with him once a week for the better part of a school year. So I sat with him every week almost. I also taped the conversation, so I have all these tapes of a conversation. And one morning I'm sitting with Wiesel, and suddenly there's a knock on the door. We're sitting in his office, and there's a knock on the door, and Elie Wiesel says, come in. And a man came in who Wiesel introduced me to, who was a literature professor at City College. And the literature professor says to Wiesel, I got an appointment. And Wiesel said, when? And the man said, right now. And then Elie Wiesel turned to me and said, this is Professor so-and-so of literature here at City College. And he has been telling me about this Kabbalist who lives in the Bronx. And I've been voicing my desire to meet him. So apparently we can go there right now. And Wiesel asked me if I would like to come with them. And it didn't take me long at all to say yes. So we piled into the professor's car and we drove up to the Bronx, and we get to this apartment, knock on the door, and out of the door comes this little man with a big beard and white hair and payas. And this was the Kabbalist who the professor was referring to. And at the time, I was wildly obsessed with genealogy. You know, I wrote a couple of books on Jewish genealogy, and it was my obsession for the longest time. And we got into this man's apartment, this Kabbalist's apartment, and he walks right up to me with almost face to face, like this, and said to me, so, what are you interested in? Can you tell me what you're interested in one sentence? And I said that I was interested in genealogy. I don't remember what the one sentence was, but I tried to explain in one sentence, as the guy asked for, what I'm interested in. And then you'll see my chutzpah as a guy of 20 some odd years old. I looked at him and I said, so, I understand that you're a Kabbalist. Can you explain to me what that means in one sentence? And he said to me, yeah, sure. In the beginning, there was a cataclysm. And what I didn't understand then, but I understand now, that he's talking about that image from Kabbalah, that God had a vessel and poured divine light into the vessel, and the vessel couldn't contain the divine light. So the vessel shattered, and the stuff of the world are the shards from that shattered vessel. But I didn't know that at the time. And he said, in the beginning, there was a cataclysm. He then looked at me and he said to me, you know, I could explain what Kabbalah is to you in less than a sentence. He said, in fact, I can express to you what Kabbalah is without even uttering a word. I said, yeah, I'd love to see that. What are you thinking of? And he said to me, this is Kabbalah. Which I didn't understand at the moment either, but I've come to understand that what he was doing is he was kind of miming the notion that I lost my train of thought for a second. That when the God offered the Torah to the children of Israel, what did we say? We said Na'aseh v'nishma, which means we will do and we will listen. Now it's a crazy kind of formula. Usually I listen and then I'll do it. I don't do it and then I listen. But the notion is that no, you do it, and by doing it you learn it. So the chassid was saying, when you're dipping your finger into the pot and tasting it, that's how you learn Kabbalah, not by sitting back and looking at it just theoretically, but involving yourself in it, going into the pot, looking at it and seeing how delicious it is. So that was my little encounter with this Kabbalist in the Bronx. I want to thank you again for inviting me here. You're lucky that you have this ongoing group that you can talk about these matters. And maybe I'll see you again sometime.
Maybe we would be happy to have you come again. Yes, we would happy.
You're welcome to come anytime.
Yeah, at 12 o'clock every Tuesday, you can log on if you want.
Okay.
Anybody else, anything? Otherwise, Professor? Professor is the correct title, right? Or,
you can call me Arthur.
Arthur, okay.
Professor Arthur.
We were very happy to have you today. And everyone else, I thank you for being here today and sharing with us. I hope you don't mind. I started recording it. I didn't ask your permission ahead of time. Is that okay if we record this and we may put it on our YouTube channel for our shul?
Feel free.
Okay. I just want to make sure that you're okay with that.
Thanks.
There were others that couldn't make it today and were asking if it was going to be recorded, so they will be happy to watch. Thank you very much.
Okay.
We might want to re-listen.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Nice.
Great
All right,
to
everybody.
see you, Bobby. Great to see you, Arthur.